This podcast is brought to you by Tethered. Now, with deer seasons winding down, it is a great time to take the plunge into saddle hunting, especially if you've been considering it. Maybe you've just wanted to try out the gear before you made a purchase. So with that, our friends at Tethered are always coming up with ways to help saddle hunters. And this year, they're doing the Tethered Teach and Train Tour, and it's hitting 20 different cities. And the session is 100% free to attend, where you'll be able to try out all their gear. So here's what's happening, or what is also included in the event. There's a free lunch or dinner, depending on the time of the event. All their saddle hunting gear will be in one place, so you can test absolutely everything that they have. And then there's going to be lots of giveaways and freebies. There's event-only pricing and discounts on Tethered gear. And then there's insider access on some gear, so you'll get a sneak peek as to some of the things that are yet to be released. Then there'll also, of course, be saddle hunting experts there available to answer any of your questions while you're hanging and trying out the different gear. So head over to tetherednation.com and check out the Teach and Train Tour page to see the list of cities and dates. I'm planning to be at the event on May 28th through the 31st at the Seven Springs Tack Shoot, so I hope to see you all there. The first thing I do in the morning before a hunt, before a scout, or just before getting ready for work is have my morning coffee, and I'm sure most of you out there listening are the same. Make sure you're filling your mug with Skull Brew coffee, as it is the only coffee company that is both 2% for conservation certified and donates 10% of its profits to conservation organizations to help secure the future of our wild places. So head to skullbrewcoffee.com and choose between 3 killer roasts of coffee and know that you are supporting conservation with every sip. Welcome to the Truth from the Stand Deer Hunting Podcast, brought to you by Skull Brew Coffee Company. I'm your host, Clint Campbell, and you're listening to episode number 162. Today I'm joined by Jared Sheffler of Whitetail Adrenaline, and we'll be talking aggressive ground and pound public land strategies. So stay tuned. All right. What is up, everyone? Happy Wednesday to you. Hope you're doing well. Hope you are feeling fine. It is a sad day here in the Truth from the Stand Hookah Lounge Studio. I think it's what I refer to it as, the Hookah Lounge Studio. Whitetail season has ended for me, and it ended unceremoniously. In fact, the bummer of it was that we had some really gnarly rain come through, which was just kind of like a complete washout for the day. It stopped raining at one point during the day. And look, I'm not opposed to sitting out in the rain. I sat out in like the weathery, wintry mix the weekend before, but I just did not see any use sitting out in a monsoon for the day. It did let up at one point around 3 o'clock. Well, I guess it was probably about 1:30, 2 o'clock actually. I went and checked, and I thought maybe I could run out and maybe sneak in and slip a hunt in, thinking that animals would get up and move while they had a little break in the weather. But, as I was thinking about getting ready to go, the rain picked back up and it started pouring again, and that was kind of it. So my hunting season is over. Pennsylvania tag goes unfilled. But look, my season was pretty good this year. I'm not gonna complain. So, as I do, I quickly turn the page and start thinking about what's going to be going on for next year. Already making plans to check out some stuff and make a trip to the One Piece in Ohio. Do some scouting. We'll probably hit it here toward the end of February is what I think what the plan is, and then I may end up going and turkey hunting it, possibly. We'll see if that comes to fruition. I always kind of make this grand plan of going and turkey hunting in Ohio and doing a little hunt/scout type deal. But every year it seems that I fail to make it. Things get busy, and it's one of those things, man, where you put so much effort into the hunting season, and then whenever it's really tough. I think, at least for me, look, it's kind of tough for me to get out after the holidays kind of pass, because my wife and my family are really understanding the rest of the year, like mid-September through basically January 1st, and let me kind of do whatever I want to do. And it's not that anyone ever tells me that I can't go hunt, but there's part of me that, as the responsible adult husband and dad, feels like after Christmas, like I really ought to back burner the trips away, and prioritizing hunting every free opportunity that I have. And so, a lot of times I'll, like today, could I have gone out, Possibly the weather was crappy. Really wasn't looking forward to it. Last weekend, could have I gone out earlier in the morning and did an all day kind of hunt? Yeah, I could have, but then I wouldn't have been able to spend any time, over the course of the weekend with the wife and the kid. Just, truth be told, Saturday, if I'm out hunting, and Sunday we have coffee stuff going on and stuff like that. And then that's really the day, that I'm able to kind of get anything done as far as the podcast is concerned, and anything related to YouTube, since that's something I'm trying to do more of this year. And so Sunday really becomes kind of a work day. And so that really doesn't leave a whole lot of time for family stuff. So I try to, after the first of the year, I try to reduce my time in the timber. But we'll be getting out doing a little scout and shed hunting just around the corner, so that's good and exciting. But for me, man, looking back on the season, like John and I will do a look back here in the not so distant future and kind of analyze our hunts and stuff like that. But there are a few things I feel like I could have done a little differently. I feel like in PA, I feel like I pressed the envelope a little too hard, probably in September and early October in one particular area. Like there's sometimes I feel like I pressed it too hard, and then there's sometimes I feel like I didn't press it hard enough. Like I feel like I had a spot that I was into, and I was having sightings of this deer, and I broke my own rule kind of. I kind of got married to the spot, which is something that I've tried to break the habit of, and it was something I broke the habit of when I went to Iowa. So maybe that's a good omen. But we're not going to spend a lot of time on the upfront for this one today, because I got a super cool show lined up for you, the one that I've been pretty pumped about to do for a few months actually. But before I do that, I want to do a quick piece of housekeeping. I just want to make mention that the Pennsylvania chapter of Backcountry Hunters and Anglers will be at the Great American Outdoor Show in Harrisburg from February 1st through the 9th. Be sure to visit their booth and learn what they're all about. They'll have membership specials and prizes throughout the week. So if you've not signed up for your new BHA membership, or if you've not renewed, that'll be a great time to do so. Also, they're having a backcountry bash at the Appalachian Brewing Company in Harrisburg on Friday, February 7th. That starts at 6 p.m. So be sure to check that out. Those are always a good time. And then also be sure to follow them on Instagram and Facebook to learn more about them and how they're helping to fight the good fight on our behalf here in Pennsylvania. So with that, I have Jared Scheffler from Whitetail Adrenaline on the show today. So if you remember, back to the Iowa trip and so forth, there was a couple ground opportunities that I had, and one that I hunted and I rattled a buck in, which was cool. And so for me, and I'll dive into this a little bit more, like I said, when John and I go back, do our kind of wrap up for the year. But ground hunting is something that I'm really wanting to add to my repertoire. I have a couple setups that I've avoided in the past just because there was nowhere to get into a tree at all, period, full stop. So with that, I feel like, those are probably areas where there's probably decent deer hanging out. Why? Because if I'm not able to hunt it, there's probably a lot of other people that aren't able to hunt it. So that's probably a little bit of a place where deer can go and not get bothered. And so I was introduced to Whitetail Adrenaline. Like I've known of them for a while. I see them actually make mention. They'll be at the Harrisburg show as well. So if you're heading to Harrisburg, be sure to stop by the Whitetail Adrenaline booth. And John is actually, buddies with Chansey. And I was when I was out in Iowa last year in March to do a little bit of scouting, he just had one of their videos on. And I had never I'd seen like clips and stuff like that, but I'd never sat down and watched. And so we got back from shed hunting one evening, and it just happened to be on TV. And I sat down and I watched maybe 30 minutes of it or whatever, 40 minutes of it before, whatever he and I were going out to do something. And it was awesome. So if you've not watched their DVDs, like I recommend you pick one up because they're killer. And it's just kind of, it took me a minute until this year, until I had a couple setups where I thought maybe the ground would work better than, being elevated, to really kind of pique my interest. So when I got back from my trip, I ended up getting a Whitetail Adrenaline DVD and watching it. And those dudes are just savages. And if you want to see some like action-packed ground hunting, you're going to want to check those guys out. And so this, for me, like you'll probably see a theme a little bit this year, where I'm really going to kind of try to focus and have some guys on, and or girls, if I can find one, that are diehard ground hunters that get it done. And Jared was the first one I wanted to start with just because I'd watched their DVD. And they're like, you won't find a more insane approach to hunting from the ground than these guys. Which is kind of why I wanted to have him on first, because, plenty of folks will hunt from the ground and maybe take more of a measured approach. And these guys definitely are measured. They're not just throwing caution to the wind. Like, they're playing the wind. They're doing like all the things you need to do, but like their aggressiveness is second to none. And so that was kind of why I wanted to start with Jared. And it's a cool show that, that we have coming up. And then next week I'll have Zach Fehrenbaugh on from the Hunting Public. And he and I'll probably do a 2-part session on hunting from the ground. We cover a lot of stuff in that podcast, but we focus in on hunting from the ground. So as I'd mentioned, you'll start to see a little bit of a theme for this year where I'm kind of focusing on having some folks on talking about ground hunting, because it's something selfishly that I really want to add to my game. And I think a lot of you out there listening, it's one of those things that we all probably stay away from, because it adds an additional element of difficulty to it, especially with a bow. And so maybe we just avoid it because of how challenging it could be. But I really think if you add it to your bag of tricks, as an option, not as the only way to hunt, but as an option, probably up the opportunities and up the encounters. And that's at least the conversations I've had thus far with like Jared and Zach. Like, that's exactly what they found whenever they switched to ground hunting, was like their encounters went through the roof. So I'm really intrigued to add it to my bag of tricks this year, and wanted to start that conversation. So with that, we'll get on the line here with Jared. But as always, thank you guys for listening. Just kidding. I have one last thing. If you're headed to the Harrisburg show, February 1st through the 9th, I believe, be sure to stop by the Exodus booth and see my boys from Exodus. I will also be there the first weekend of the show, and most likely the last weekend as well. And now for real, let's get Jared on the line. All right, folks, welcome back to another episode of the Truth from the Stand Deer Hunting Podcast. And today's episode is one that I've been looking forward to doing for a while. This gentleman that I have on the other line is a guy that I've watched some of his material a little bit from afar at first. I got turned on to these guys by Johnny Utah Mulligan, and watched some DVDs while I was out at his house. And I did a little ground hunting while I was in Iowa on this most recent trip, this rut trip this past year, which kind of sparked my interest. And so then I picked up a DVD of theirs this year and digested it, and ground hunting something I want to add to my arsenal. So I was like, you know what? I should probably just find like the craziest dudes I could possibly find for ground hunting and see if I can't pick their brain and learn a little bit of something. And I'm talking about the Whitetail Adrenaline's no other than Jared Scheffler. What's going on, man?
Well, I don't know if I'm the craziest, but
well, I don't know.
Thank
man.
you. I appreciate that. I mean, you obviously, maybe you haven't watched all the videos, but you've definitely, if you have or would, you definitely see all the things that has gone wrong and all that craziness over the years too.
Yeah. I've seen a few things go awry, man. Which is, for me, man, that just builds character, right?
Yeah. I guess I guess it's all about the stories. What we always, every time something goes wrong, I shouldn't say every time, but a lot of times recently, the last couple of years, I'll look, if I'm with like Matt Zinnial, who's filming, I'll look at him and I'll just go, it's all about the story.
That's right, man. That's right.
Obviously it didn't go quite the way we wanted it to or whatnot, but that's hunting. And
right.
That happens.
I always kind of prefer, whenever there's a little bit of, failure or tough times or whatever, like as part of the hunt, because to me, that's like really where like the meat of the story is. If you just walked in and killed a deer, I mean, there's not much of a story there. Am I right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
I agree 100%. I mean, trust me, when I get my butt kicked for a week or 2 weeks or however long it is, and I go to a new state and things just go way too smooth and everything, I just earned it for the last week and a half or 2 weeks or however long that is. Mm-hmm. So I guess in that sense, I'm all right with it. But if every hunt was like that, then yeah, it wouldn't be much of a hunt. That wouldn't be the reason why it just wouldn't be, I probably wouldn't enjoy it as much as I do. But obviously I'm kind of hooked on hunting whitetails and on the ground. And
Right.
I think a big part of that is just because it is very difficult.
Yep. Yep. 100%.
Uh,
So let me
so
ask you, man. Just for those out there listening that may not be as familiar with you and whitetail adrenaline in general, could you just give me a little bit of background about yourself? Where you're from and how you got started hunting.
yeah, I grew up in West Central Wisconsin, Menominee, Wisconsin, to be more specific. Grew up on a small dairy farm. My dad, we worked really hard, long hours on the farm, and hunting was kind of like the thing I grew up around. That was okay, I guess, if you would. Like you could take a little time and go hunting, but there was a lot of work to be done on the farm, and so hunting was really just kind of a release. But I just really, I remember at a young age, before I was old enough to hunt in Wisconsin, you had to be 12 at the time. I remember back in those days, we'd have a small group of maybe 10, 12 guys that they got together every gun season to do some small pushes and whatnot. And I just remember staying up and getting up early and listening to the deer stories from the old timers. And it was just really addicting. And I guess for as long as I can remember, I mean, hunting's been what I really enjoy the most, I guess, as far as a hobby, if you would, which obviously a hobby kind of turned into sort of a living, I guess, which it is a fine line to balance, but overall I still enjoy it, obviously.
Right.
So,
Right. Yeah, exactly. I mean, as much work as you guys put into what you do, it's like if you didn't enjoy it, then it would be kind of insanity, for as much work as you guys do.
yeah,
The so
yeah.
so you grew up on the farm. When did I guess starting to like dabble or hunting public land really kind of start to be a thing that you were really kind of pursuing more so than just hunting the family farm?
We didn't have much acreage on the family farm. I mean, there was really only about, I'm going to say maybe 10 acres of like grass
Mm-hmm.
at the back of a couple of crop fields. It was a small dairy farm, but most of the ground was cropland that was already taken off. So occasionally there'd be a little bit of standing corn. So most of the hunting I grew up with was either hunting a big public land swamp that was just a few miles away. There was a couple other smaller parcels of public, or else in the time and place where I grew up, hunting wasn't as much like it is today. What I mean by that is I could knock on a lot of different farmers' doors. Most of them would let me hunt, and they let other people hunt too.
Right.
So even a lot of those farms were, they weren't leased or whatnot. There's other hunters that could hunt there. It was no different really than hunting the public land at that time in that era, just because it wasn't a managed situation, I guess, if you would.
Right, right, yeah. I mean, I guess out there, people think about those who have access to farms. They think of like having blocks of timber and stuff like that. But the reality is a lot of times these farms are in agriculture as much as possible because that's how folks are making money. Or in your case, how you're likely feeding cows to milk. To where
What's
it's like
that?
I said, a lot of times these farms, it's like
Yep.
people think that they're just big blocks of timber that are within these farms. But, most of the time you're trying to turn as much as you can into, tillable acreage for either a cash crop, or to feed to the, to the stock that you have on the farm to make your living, to make your money. So hunting's not the priority. It's kind of like the nice byproduct of the farm if you have it, right?
Yeah, exactly. All those farms, they were just farmers that were, it wasn't, they weren't doing anything for deer per se. I mean, they were just, doing their normal crops for their cattle or whatnot. And it was broken up type acreage. You'd have some swamp mixed with smaller timber, or maybe it's 100-acre woods and there's, crop fields around it or whatever, but nothing was, there wasn't food plots and any sort of activity done, by anyone or the farmer to cater it to deer,
Right. Right.
So.
So whenever you started hunting, I mean, was bow hunting something that was in your family? Did you start bow hunting? Or did you start gun hunting? Like a lot of folks do, and then transition to bow hunting. And was it always from the ground, or did you start, in an elevated platform like a tree stand or something like that?
Yeah, no, I grew the first year I could hunt was when I was 12. So I remember I started bow hunting as soon as I could. My dad did bow hunting as well. I started with a hand-me-down Black Bear is what the bow was called, and it was had these tiny little plastic wheels on it. I remember my brother bought it from a retail store called Fleet Farm back in the day for probably $60 or $80.
Right.
It wasn't much of a bow, but it it got me kind of rolling or whatnot. And then it was shotgun for a weapon only, no rifles in that area. So then that first season I partook with a shotgun. I got a Remington 870 Wingmaster at a gun show used. I still have that gun. I love that gun. But
nice.
So from that first year forward, I've always bow hunted and I've always gun hunted. I grew up in when my dad would take me out hunting, there wasn't tree stands, but I was pretty squirrely, I guess you could say. and I remember a lot of different times, we'd walk into a wood lot or whatever. It might be a little funnel point where a swamp meets, or some timber meets a swamp or whatever. And my dad would point to something that he thought maybe I could get up. Well, can you get up there, in that crotch of that tree or hang out on that limb up there?
Right.
And I'm not kidding you. The first couple of seasons, I don't think I even had a tree peg. My dad was a good climber too. And so he just, sometimes there wouldn't be branches for 10 feet, and you just kind of like bear hug the tree and climb up there. And that's really how I started hunting, occasionally on the ground, just a little bit here and there, but usually, the way I was taught was to try to get to something elevated. It wasn't a must by any standard or anything like that. I didn't get one for a couple of years. But the first buck I shot was exactly like that. I was in the crotch of a small tree, and the crotch was so tight in the tree that I only had room for one foot. I had to set my other foot on top of the other foot, and
nice.
that's kind of how I grew up. And when I was 16, that's the first time that I kind of really remember starting to pursue whitetails more heavily on the ground.
Right.
I had a handful of situations that season when I was 16, and I continued to use tree stands for about 7 years after that, I guess, somewhere in that ballpark. I had a couple of 10-pound. Summit made them back in that day, and you'd hang the strap and you'd hook the tree stand on. They were very light, very quiet, very easy to put up. And so I played that in and out game. And then eventually in 2010, so we just got done with 10 straight seasons of just hunting solely on the ground like a spot and stalk or still hunt fashion.
Nice.
But up until 2010, I still played that tree stand game, and then abandoned it going into 2010.
Nice. Yeah. And it just seems like, being from the ground just kind of completely frees you up. Like so for me, it's like I started hunting on the ground, and that was the only way my dad really ever hunted. So I never was in an elevated position until I was probably in my 30s, because we just always still hunted from the ground. And then this year, I was in a spot in Iowa, this CRP field with a draw on it where I ended up kicking a really big deer out of it on this piece of public. And so I went in the next day to hunt him from the ground. And it was just, I don't know, there was something about being at eye level. I ended up rattling a buck in, it wasn't a shooter, but it was just still cool to rattle one in, come in that close and be on the ground with them. It was just a different experience, man. And it was one of those things where I was like, there's a lot of setups I've walked away from over the course of time because I didn't have a tree to get into, and I was like, hunting from the ground, I was like, would open up some of those opportunities. I was like, and especially, I was just curious to get your take on this too. Like, I almost feel like because so many people avoid hunting from the ground, I imagine there's setups that if it's exclusively on the ground, there's likely going to be deer there that are comfortable because they also know that people aren't going to go into those places because there's no tree, or if you will, for someone to hunt them from. Do you find that to be the case where you get into some of these places that might have pressure where those grounds exclusive kind of areas that are ground set up almost only that tend to kind of, hold the best deer?
Occasionally I felt like maybe that's the case. I don't know if they necessarily consciously like, oh, there's no trees here, but I do definitely think that they sense pressure levels, and find those pockets, and if that pocket just happens to not have trees, it happens to not have trees. And so I would say that what you said is very accurate. I'm just not sure whether they actually, process it,
Right.
by like looking at it, like, is there trees where they could set up or anything like that? Maybe that's not what you meant, but I would say that, mature whitetails, they don't generally like people. And Chansey, I say that the first time I heard it, Chansey told me that he's like, big bucks don't like people, and it was kind of funny. He said it in a funny way or whatever. It sounds so silly, but yet it's like in most situations, unless you're hunting like city type deer, they don't like people. And so they're going to be in locations that, or generally be in pockets and locations where they aren't getting bothered as much, unless the whole area has a lot of pressure. Then, I think they just adapt to it and are a little bit, they're just very aware creatures in those situations, and they'll still probably be hanging out in the least pressured parts of those, pockets or areas where there's pressure all over the place, I guess, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it totally does. It's one of those things where it's like, find where the people aren't, and then that's where you might want to be. And in my mind, it's like, if there's less hunting opportunities, like, so let's say, for example, if 95% of people who hunt whitetails with a bow in my area, just saying my area, hunt from trees, and there's no trees in an area, I'd maybe want to look at that area that doesn't have a lot of huntable trees, because there would probably be less pressure and less people.
Correct.
Equals, likely that, mature deer would maybe prefer that area. I kind of look at swamps almost the same way, because a lot of people, heard an old timer one time tell me, big bucks like wet feet, kind of alluding to the fact that, like, the nastier and the crappier the terrain is, the wetter it is, and the more limited bedding opportunities that they might have, less likely people are to be there, less likely the deer you're looking for is probably there, or more likely the deer you're looking for is probably there. So
right.
Yeah. So
I'd agree with that.
So at what point did not that hunting from the ground isn't hard enough, but at what point did you start to add filming into what you were doing almost on every hunt?
That the first season was filmed in 2007, so we've filmed every season since then.
Wow.
So, like I said, I completely abandoned the tree stands in 2010. So the first 3 seasons of our videos have some on the ground and some tree stand, which is kind of, I've never went back and watched them after I'm done editing them. Someday I probably will.
Right.
But it's probably kind of neat to watch the transition or the progression of, obviously we got more and more aggressive over the years in different ways, and with that sometimes comes a lot of failure and missed opportunities or mistakes as well. But
Right.
That's part of the deal.
Speaking of missed opportunities and failures, I'm always curious, what is in your mind, it might not be the biggest buck that you've ever missed or whatever the case might be, but what in your mind do you think is like the biggest, blown opportunity that you've had, and maybe you learned something super valuable from it that helped you be successful, like as you've gone through the years? What might that one kind of instant be?
The one that really brings that it's the one that got away, I guess you could say, for me. Is there's many that have gotten away, but this one kind of stands head and shoulders above the rest. It was in our 2012 season, so that would have been Calm Before the Storm. There was a big giant brow tine buck that I was playing games with, and he had brow tines are kind of my thing. Like, I love them, and he had probably a 14-inch one and a 12-inch one. So, a big clean 5x5, and this deer really liked it on the private. And one day I caught him on the public and with a doe in a pretty good situation, and it's all on video. And he finally bedded down with her. It was perfect. I snuck up there. It was perfect, other than there was some tall weeds, probably 5-foot tall weeds.
Mm-hmm.
But the DNR had cut a swath through this weed field. So you'd have tall weeds for like a 20-yard swath, and then you'd have 20 yards of approximately of cut, just like if you were to cut a hayfield, right?
Right.
So he was bedded in one of those with the doe. So it was perfect. I didn't have to make noise getting up there, anything. The only thing is, once I got up there, I had a little bit of a struggle trying to find him in those tall weeds.
Right, yeah.
But I finally picked him out with the binocs, and I was about 21 yards away from him. And we already had good footage of him when he was on his feet, and for some reason, I felt like we should try to get a clip of him. And I was like, looking back, I'm like, that was so dumb. There was not a chance we could possibly get a clip of this deer in those weeds. Like, I could barely make out, an inch by inch piece of him. Right. You know what I mean? And I don't know if it was him or his doe, but I got Andy, who was running the camera, up there, and one of them detected something through those weeds, and they flushed out of their beds. So that is one of the many blunders that I've had that forever haunts me, I guess.
Right, right. And I'm assuming this guy was like a pretty nice brow tine buck, foot in the bill for you.
Yeah, he was probably upper 70s to low 80s, clean 5x5. So yeah, he would have done.
Yeah, he would have done. Understatement, right?
Yeah, right. That's what I mean.
Yeah.
So
man, yeah, it's I've never had the luxury. So being completely honest, I've talked about this before on the podcast, but the biggest deer I've ever seen was this last trip to Iowa. I jumped out of that CRP field that I tried to hunt from the ground. That was the first booner I'd ever seen on the hoof, like first time ever, and it was just like. I'm from Pennsylvania, so you don't see those all the time. You know what I mean? So just seeing that, it was like blowing my mind. And then I ended up missing, probably I guess he was like a mid 140s 8-point on like the 6th day. And that was the biggest deer I'd ever drawn back on. And that was enough to piss me off and make me sick for a couple of days. But I couldn't imagine seeing like 170 clean 10 just decide to hop up and bound out of my life. I'd maybe throw my bow at it, yell at it, see if I could stop him, chase him down, something.
Yeah, in a panic, I threw an arrow, which I guess wasn't probably something I should have done. But I guess I think the doe actually pegged me, and at the instant, I knew right where he was, and I let fly, but my arrow didn't get there in time.
Right,
so,
right.
Yeah.
So,
and I've had a lot of mistakes over the years on big bucks playing these cat and mouse games. So that's just one of many. But
yeah, well, that means you've learned a lot in the process, right?
Yeah, right.
Exactly.
Right. Or hope so. Right?
Yeah, that's the hope anyway.
I do actually feel like I have gotten sharper for a while. I wasn't sure if the first year we kind of did the all on the ground. We had a lot of mistakes, and I just kind of like thought to myself, well, that's going to happen. It's going to take a few seasons to really kind of hone in on this. And really, I had been doing it for years, but like full-time filming it like that, I mean, there's just a lot more variables in there. Yeah. And, it just didn't feel like we were closing the failure rate as quick as what I would have liked. But I have felt really like this last season. I felt really good about a lot of the stocks and situations that I guess I was on, and Chancey as well. He's been hunting whitetails on the ground now for 4 seasons. Mm-hmm. And I mean, that guy's an animal. Yeah. I've still yet to film him kill a buck. We did some hunting together a little bit the first year, and we've done some since then, but he has went out there on his own and he lays the smack down on him. I mean, this year he got upper 70s buck on public. He played cat and mouse with that deer for 3 days. It's an awesome story. Yeah, he's an animal.
Yeah, man. Well, I mean, you guys are all beasts, man. That's for sure, dude. I watch you guys in awe whenever you put these stalks on, and even just locating these deer and the amount of time that you guys take to find good deer. You know what I mean? Like how diligent you are with that process and stuff like that. But, the one thing I wanted to ask was, I've got some buddies that hunt on the ground, and I've watched other folks hunt on the ground, whether it's on film or whatever the case might be, or a web TV show or whatever that might be. But you guys are like what I appreciate about what you guys do is just like how aggressive you are in that aggressive style, compared to others that I've kind of watched do something similar. Where did that kind of aggressive approach come from? How did it develop? There's, like I said, there's other guys who will try to hunt from the ground and stuff like that, but you guys kind of have a style all unto yourselves and do it a little bit differently. Where did that come from?
I think a lot of that came from back in the early days of doing the videos, and this is a big reason why we went to hunting whitetails on the ground specifically, is those first 3 seasons, we had hunts on the ground on every one of those videos. But most of my time I still spent in a tree stand, I'd say, throughout the season. But it just seemed like we would get on more, we'd have more situations, more encounters, things like that, hunting on the ground. And at that time, we only had one camera that we were filming everything with, and we're trying to make enough, produce enough content, get enough animals, throughout the season to produce one solid video to keep the wheels going. And so we were kind of like, I don't want to say we were forced into it, but it was kind of like, for me, I loved hunting on the ground more so than the tree stand by far. And then along with it, the encounter rate I felt was always seemed to be higher. And it just, I liked all those aspects of it, and it just made sense. It was like, okay, if we play strictly a tree stand game with one camera rolling throughout the season, and at that time we weren't out there that much. I mean, we were more weekend warriors,
right?
Sort of speak. We didn't have 60 days throughout the year to make it happen. So I just knew that we would need to change up our tactics, I guess, in order to get the kind of content that we're going to need,
right,
on a regular basis.
Right. Yeah. No, that makes sense. I mean, I this upcoming year will be, the first year maybe that I add hunting to my arsenal, or hunting from the ground to my arsenal as like a more deployable, strategy, if you will. I hunt a lot out of a saddle, which allows me to be mobile. And that
Sure.
was like this year, I was able to be super mobile because I was able to move that light. And so I spent a lot of time boots on the ground, scouting, moving from place to place to place. And my encounter rate went way up, so I can just kind of attest to like the idea, like you guys are like the ultimate in mobility. And the more mobile you are, the more opportunities you have to have encounters with deer, but not just that, the type of deer that you want to have encounters with too, which I think is important. But how?
Sure. And
go ahead.
Just like going back to kind of what you said too, is what kind of brewed that. The other thing is we don't do any pre-scouting, and we don't have our eye on this deer or that deer. So I think by going into an area or a piece of public or whatever without having a bunch of prior knowledge, I think when you have that prior knowledge, you play a different game a little bit. You play more of a passive card, I think, in a lot of those situations. So I think that also contributes to why we kind of have a little bit more of a carefree, all-in approach, if that kind of makes sense.
No, it totally makes sense, and I love that, because this year, again, hunting around PA here near home, it's like I do plenty of scouting, and I do catch myself playing that more passive game, which I don't like to do, and I find myself doing it just subconsciously almost. But whenever I do go out of state, like whether it was the Iowa trip this year or not, I did come out early, like in March, and scouted, but I ended up hunting the piece, and where I ended up killing my deer was a piece of public that I had never stepped foot on. I looked at some maps. I ended up talking to a local, and he was like, hey, I was like, hey, I'm thinking of this. He was a really good dude. And I kind of pointed to him in a map where I was thinking of looking. He was like, have you hunted it? And I said, no. And he asked me if I'd scouted it, and I said, no. He's like, I've hunted this area for a long time. He's like, there's typically pretty good deer in that general area. So I was like, cool. So I just kind of like booked it to that spot and just started hiking, walking, finding sign. I know you guys do a lot of, glassing and stuff like that, but I went in with no preconceived notion of what was there, what I was going to run into, and so I wasn't married to a place. I was married to whatever happened to be the hottest sign at the moment was what I was going to hunt, and it worked out, So I think there's a lot to be said I think it's almost freeing when you have less information at times. What do you think? Do you kind of buy into that as well?
More free, you say?
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree 100%.
Yeah.
You don't feel like you have obligation to be there. If when I come in cold to an area or a spot, I treat that spot just as that. I don't have any prior information, so if I don't get a good feeling about it, there's a lot of pressure. I don't get visual on anything. I don't see much for sign, whatever it might be. It's really easy for me to, okay, scrap that play, go to the next playbook chapter or whatever, you know what I mean? And let's go check out this piece of public or that piece. It's really easy for me to do that. I'm not locked down to any particular piece, which I also have gotten very comfortable. So I don't look at aerials and study them all and everything like that before I go hunting an area or a spot. And part of that is years ago, I just didn't have time to do all of that. I mean, that might sound crazy, but with trying to work, produce the video, all of that, I just didn't have time to do that, going to shows in the spring. And then I just got to the point where I'm like, you know what? I have a certain degree of advantage by going in cold, though, too. I kind of realized that was an accident.
Right.
But I think the person going in cold isn't locked down or emotionally attached to sign and information that happened in the past because they've never been there. So it's really easy for them to come in, survey it. Okay, nope, this isn't what I'm looking for. Move on, roll out to the next piece.
Right. It really makes you honest to the most recent intelligence you have, that you're making decisions based on real live in the moment data, right? It's like I see buck,
correct,
or I see the sign I want, or whatever the case is, which allows you just to kind of have no emotional attachment to a specific deer even, right? It's like, how many people do you know, or I know plenty, where it's like they get attached to a specific deer, and it's like he hasn't shown his face in daylight or on public in 3 weeks, but you're still hunting him.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Right.
It's like,
it's easy to do. That happened to Chansey this last season, and it wasn't a bad thing. He got on a giant deer, 200 plus.
Wow.
First day out in Kansas, total fluke, goes into a spot, forgot his rattle and antlers on the trip, walks into a gas station, finds some old timer that's got some sheds that are, I bet they're 15-year-old sheds. They're dry, they're white. They're not what you want to be out there rattling with, but it was the best he had to work with. And he just wanted to go into this spot and rattle. And he goes in there and he rattles in this giant. And the deer was so close to getting, shot. He almost couldn't get closer. I mean, it was just one of them deals. It'll unfold on video. But anyways, Chansey ended up kind of devoting himself for the most part, the rest of, his Kansas bow hunt to trying to kill that deer. And he got visuals on him 3 more times. One day he was on the other side of the public, and from what we had seen with some other deer, it appeared that he was locked down with a doe, but there was a really good chance he was going to cross the road and get on public, but he ended up not. There was some vehicle traffic. We don't know if they got nervous about that or what, but he ended up not getting them. But on a deer like that, I guess I wouldn't wrong a guy for doing it, but generally speaking, we try to avoid that.
Right. Yeah. Definitely not passing judgment on that one. And that, folks, is another reason why you buy the Whitetail Adrenaline DVD coming out next year, so you can watch that hunt. Right there, you go. So I wanted to ask.
I wasn't intentionally plugging the next video, but it is going to be a good one.
No, I'm gonna plug it because I'm gonna check it out. So it's so I wanted to ask, man, as aggressive as you guys are, I've watched you guys, it's whenever people see you guys are aggressive, it's not that you guys are negligent necessarily in terms of throwing caution to the wind. You're being calculated when you're making the moves that you're making and stuff like that. So how do you balance being as aggressive as you guys are, but at the same time being patient and taking the time to make an approach on an animal that you have a visual on, so you don't kind of blow it before it starts?
A lot runs through okay, so for instance, if I spot a big buck, a shooter will. There's a lot that runs through my head in a short amount of time. Like, there's a lot of different situations that can happen. Obviously the first and foremost, is he on public? Okay, if he's on public, is he traveling? If he's traveling, how much public do I have to work with? Do I think he's going to hold up before getting to private? Is he locked down with a doe? So there's a lot of different variables that come into play that are going to make, in a matter of sometimes seconds, and sometimes it takes a few minutes of evaluation to decide what the right play is. If the deer is cruising and I don't have much time and it looks like he's going to get off of public, I'm going to be, V-lining to try to beat him there immediately,
Right.
wherever that might be, if that's possible. If the deer's locked out, if he's with a doe, he might be running around chasing that doe a little bit, but it appears that he's staying with her, not just checking her out. Then I'm probably going to hold back a little bit and keep my visual, maintain my visual. That's really key.
Mm-hmm.
It's really easy to falsely assume that they're going to be right here. And so I really like to, if they're with a doe and I don't feel they're going to leave the public, I'm going to do my best to maintain my visual until I feel comfortable that they're bedded and going to be bedded for a while. So what I mean by that is, if I got a big buck with a doe and it's shortly after sunup and they're smack dab in, with public all around them, and I don't see any chance that they're probably, or very likely that they're going to leave that public. If they bed shortly after sunup, I'm probably going to sit there for the next hour and a half, 2 hours, and I'm going to wait until they get back on their feet. Sometimes usually they'll almost always get back up on their feet an hour and a half. If they bed that quick in the morning, like a half hour after sunup, usually they're going to be back on their feet within an hour and a half, maybe sooner. Maybe it'll be 2 hours, but sometime before 10 o'clock, they'll probably get back on their feet. And if I think I can get in there quick enough and it's not going to take me much time to get in there, yeah, I might do that right away. But a lot of times I found in recent years, I hold off and I watch them, because sometimes they just get on their feet, stretch a little bit and rebed. And sometimes they'll move 300 yards. And I don't want to be in a spot where while I'm moving in on, they reposition and now I have no clue where they went.
Right.
So, if that kind of makes sense. And obviously the wind, I don't worry about the wind until I've actually kind of like decided what I want to do or then it's like, okay, what's the wind? And I check weather.com or AccuWeather or whatever. And I check the wind direction forecast for the rest of the day. So I know approximately, okay, I've only got 2 hours with this wind direction, or it's going to change like this. I need to come in at this angle. And usually I'm not coming in straight downwind. Usually I'm using like a crosswind. In some cases, I barely, if I feel like the wind is going to be very consistently blowing, I'll get a pretty good read and I'll keep checking that as I'm moving in. And if it stays pretty consistent, I might just cheat that wind just barely. I mean, if they were 3 yards or 5 yards left or right, they'd smell me. I might cheat it that close. I've done that before. And I've also had a couple of situations where the wind switched for a split second and the prevailing wind didn't kick in quick enough to keep my wind blowing, and it cost me. But I don't come in that tight unless there's a reason, like, like, okay, that's the only way I can do this with trying to get it on video and keep us concealed or whatever.
Right. Now that makes sense. You hit on a bunch of stuff that I wanted to follow up on. The first one was, maintaining your visual. Like, how do you guys manage that? Because I know you guys drive around a ton, glassing and so forth, and that's like some serious dedication. Because there's sometimes I'm watching and you guys I'm like, I don't know that I could put that much time in a seat, like looking. You know what I mean? Like, you guys are diligent about it. But whenever
that's a mental endurance game. That's actually more difficult that's by far more difficult than going out into the woods. I'd much rather be out in the woods, but we got to produce content each year, and in those open type areas, And the plains of Kansas is totally different. But even in some of the broken country, generally, I try to be in a location. I mean, you can go in and you can sit in what's called an observatory location, but I've just found that, I can cover more ground with a vehicle or a boat or something like that. And there has been situations where I've had to actually walk into a piece that I've got a really good feeling about, and I, get to a spot where I can observe, quite a bit of acreage and try to get a visual that way. And that's worked as well. So you're correct in that statement about, like, I don't know if I could spend that much time in a seat. Trust me, if you're thinking it, you're absolutely right, because sometimes it's 3-4 days of that garbage before you finally get your opportunity.
3-4 days that, or getting stuck in a snowdrift, or changing a flat tire, or whatever hijinks you guys happen to get into.
Yeah, well, to be honest with you, like that day where we got stuck in the snow, I mean, that was actually more fun than a lot of those days where we're putting all those miles on and not seeing anything. We actually had something to laugh about all day.
Right. So the other thing I wanted to ask you was, I'll follow up with the crosswind thing, because that was one of the things I was really kind of interested in, because I feel like, I'll just give you the scenario that I had while I was in Iowa, and then I want you to kind of give me your perspective on how you approach deer in general whenever you're going to put a sneak on. And so I got to the top of this CRP field. I glassed. I didn't see him. Now, in hindsight, I probably would have switched how I was coming in, because I didn't know that there was a buck that was bedded there. But the way the wind was, it was coming in my face. So he was bedded with the wind to his back in that little draw, looking up in my direction, right? And so he saw me way before he would have. It was windy, so he saw me way before he ever heard me, and he never smelled me. I know for sure. I'm curious if you have your preference, would you rather put on a sneak coming from the deer's back and basically almost giving up the wind to them so you can, make sure that they're not able to use their nose and their eyes at the same time? Are you trying to always cut like one of their senses out to put on a sneak, or, what's your approach to that?
I definitely play the wind as best as I can. And partly because there's two of us out there. There's a guy filming and there's a guy hunting, and we just don't do anything scent elimination wise. Years ago, before I did the videos and I was solo hunted, I had a process. I could beat their nose pretty much every time. I mean, it was to the point where, I would let like the biggest buck I shot up to that point in my life in 2005. I mean, it was 13 below. He had to go downwind. He was 15 yards downwind of me and walk 120 yards out before I could get a shot with my muzzleloader. I let him walk downwind, because I had just let 28 bucks walk downwind over the course of the whole gun and muzzleloader season.
Right.
And I had a system down that good. But now, with how much we're moving around and there's two of us out there and everything, it would be just like a full-time, a good solid part-time job, just trying to maintain our scent. So I don't even deal with it. I just play the wind. A lot of times I like to crosswind stuff is what that's the game that I like to play more so. I just, not always, but oftentimes if a buck is bedded alone, he will be, not always, but a lot of times he will be doing exactly what the deer, it sounds like in your situation, was doing, which was using his nose to his back, and where he couldn't smell, he was looking.
Right.
I've found that if they're bedded if they're locked up with a doe, that could go right out the window. If they have a couple of other bucks there, generally they're all kind of facing a different direction, or at least two of them are facing opposing directions. Maybe two of them are pointed this way, but the other one's pointed the other way. They kind of got it guarded with their eyes pretty good. So, in a situation like what you're describing, depending on how tall the CRP grass is and everything like that, if I had a good feeling something was maybe laying in there, I maybe would have tried to get, you might have been already at the highest point. Maybe there was a tree that could give you an extra 10 feet of elevation. You could just climb up a couple branches to be able to see in there better. That's, and if there wasn't, that very likely would have happened to me too, where I would have blown that deer out, because without an actual visual, I'm not going to give it a ton of time unless I have a really strong feeling or, like I said, had some sort of visual or whatnot. So that's about the only thing, looking back on it, if there was something you could have climbed or a spot you could have gotten to glass it better, that would have been about the only thing different that maybe I would have done. And I can't even say that I would have, you know how it is. Yeah. Hindsight's always 20/20. Yeah. A deer like that'll probably run through your head several times over the next few years.
Oh yeah, because that was definitely the biggest deer I'd ever seen. It was one of those things where I was at the peak of that CRP field whenever you headed down into that draw. So I was skylit. I had nothing between he and I except air and opportunity. The grass wasn't too terribly tall, so it was like you said. I had no clue that he was in there. I was actually on my way over to a timber line across that draw up the other side of the CRP field to this timber line. It was where I was actually going to, and I was just so happened to be like, it was funny. I had watched a video like 2 days before, or right before I had left for my trip. That was almost like a similar style hunt from the ground. And when I got to the top of that CRP field, I was like, this looks like a great place for a buck to bed. I should probably stop and glass. And sure enough, I just never saw him when I glassed the place up. But so I'm curious, man. Whenever you guys are going out of state, do you typically go back to the areas where you've hunted before, maybe that you had good encounters the previous years, or do you try to usually find fresh pieces almost every year? And I know that you don't get married to a spot. You go in with no previous scouting intel and stuff like that. But as far as like, if a place has been good to you in the past, do you typically go back, or do you typically try to find another green pasture?
Generally speaking, if a spot or a little pocket or something has produced in the past, or the last time I was there, generally that's where I'll start. But I just treat it with a grain of salt. And a lot of times it's not that great the next year. Mm-hmm. There's just a lot of different variables that can come into play. I mean, crop rotations, other hunters could have found out about this spot or randomly just been hunting it throughout the year. There's a lot of different things that could happen. So basically, yes, my starting point is, if I've hunted that area before, the starting point is generally where I've had success in the past. And from there, if I don't feel it, I'm not getting visuals or a visual or seeing anything that is telling me I need to keep spending some time here, I move on and I check out new stuff. And right. I just kind of, and maybe the next year is better. I just kind of treat it with a grain of salt. What happened in the past, I try to treat as a grain of salt. Right. If that makes sense.
Right. I mean, you're location agnostic. You're like, I don't care what has happened in the past. We'll give it a quick sachet to see if there's it's holding true to the following year. But if I don't see something pretty quickly, I'm on to the next place.
Yeah. It's just like 2016 season. I killed a good buck in a new piece of grass. It was a grassland piece, and I've checked it out quite a bit. Chancey's checked it out quite a bit the last 3 seasons, and we've had 2 shooters on it, but it was the same season. So we've had 2 seasons where we haven't seen a shooter on it, and we have. I mean, we've checked out that piece. I don't even want. I'd hate to even guess how many times we've checked it out and glassed it and been there at first light and done a couple of rounds on it. And it's, it's one of those pieces that I've probably given it a little too much qualification just because I've shot one there, and we have had 2 situations, but that's not overly great, I guess.
Is there any particular weather that you prefer? Like, so one, is there any particular weather when you're, that you like to hunt in, that you especially see that you get the best movement or the best visuals or whatever? And then is there any particular weather that, that you prefer to, to hunt specifically as it relates to hunt on the ground?
Yes. Actually, some people are going to think I'm crazy on this. Personally, I like the temperatures to be at an average temp for that time of the year, or maybe even slightly warmer, just a touch. I know that sounds crazy. I don't mind maybe a slight temperature drop either, but I don't like it to go too crazy of a cold front. As soon as it goes to a cold front, I'm waiting for the warm front on the back end. And that's the truth. I 100%, I started talking a lot more heavily about it and sharing that with, like, Jeremy did quite a bit of hunting with me this year. He's done a lot of hunting throughout many states in his life. He thought I was full of crap. Like, he laughed. I told him, I was like, think about how much the sun actually, like, affects what we do outside of, like, hunting season.
Mm-hmm.
Think of how much it affects our life. Now we have a house to live in. You think it doesn't affect the deer? I was like, you just watch. You're going to see more deer on sun days. Like sunny days. You're going to see more deer. They're going to be, especially after a cold front like that. Deer pretty much always, from what I've seen, after a cold front, you get a little warm spell with sunshine. They're in spots where they can catch sun, and I see it, so much in the more open country where I can serve, where I might see 50 deer that morning, and the morning before it was 30 degrees colder and I didn't hardly see anything. Okay. Right. And I've surveyed this a lot over the years. I think I kind of made a couple of jokes about it the last couple years, or the last couple of videos, maybe a little bit, but I really hit it harder this last fall with like calling it. I'd call it while we were out there hunting, like, yep, cold front coming in, like, get ready, the deer are going to shut down and we're not going to see that much, and like, Jeremy studied it for about a week and he's like, I can't believe this. And then he watched it the rest of the season and he's like, yeah, it's hands down, and I was like, I think deer in the woods do the similar things. And I think what happens is I think hunters don't really generally, like, have their setups maybe set up to cap, like, obviously if deer, okay, so if hunters are going out in the woods and they're like, oh, I don't really ever see anything on Sunday, on sunny days, well, maybe their tree stands aren't set up accordingly or whatnot. Okay. Because I know that as soon as December hits, and you can talk to all the guys that pick up sheds in shed antlers in the wintertime, those deer love the south side of ridges. Obviously it's colder at that time of year, but I think that the same applies, maybe not quite to the same degree, in December and maybe doesn't apply quite as much in September and October and November as it does in December and January. But I do definitely know that from my experience and what I've watched and surveyed, that's 100% accurate from everything that I've seen. The other thing that I've noticed is, okay, so I like for a day is I actually like a sunny day, like I said, right around average temperatures, or else a warm front on the back end of the cold front, because those deer are so predictable about where they're kind of going to be, like, going to bed. Right. They're going to be bedding in those spots. So I can pretty much predict, like, okay, this is, wind directions coming out of this. If I'm hunting draw systems, it's like, okay, I want to be targeting draws that are, working a certain direction that, a lot of times the deer want to be bedded in draws that they can catch a little sun in, the wind's coming over the top. So obviously if it's a west wind and I got a draw that in the bottom is on the east side and it's going up towards the west and the draw kind of dissipates heading west, they can catch that wind coming over that west hill, and then catch sun as well. And this applies, I was hunting in an area this year where there's quite a few mule deer as well. Now, I wasn't really targeting mule deer, but I was watching how the mule deer operated, utilizing the wind and the sun much, and it was pretty close, if not identical, to how the whitetails operate, in as far as, like, okay, they're going to be in these wind directions blowing like this. They're going to be all, going into draws that are, this, it's really hard to explain over the phone. I could show you on an aerial really quick, like, or the contours really quick. Like, okay, all these types of draws are obviously going to work to their advantage with this west wind or whatever wind it might work. And then, if the wind switched like this, especially if it was a cold air, then they're going to be on this side. catching sun, and this type of draw is going to work for them to catch sun and wind. So it was really easy. It got really easy, especially this season when I started really like studying it a lot more. It got really easy for me to predict which draws not to waste my time for that day, just looking at the wind direction and the temperatures and whether the sun was out or not.
Right.
And the other thing that I've noticed, so I don't like a lot of wind generally right at sun up. Well, not ever at sun up. I don't like a lot of wind. I do like the winds to pick up to around 15, maybe pushing 20 mile an hour by like late morning, because I'm hoping I have a visual by that point. And by that point, then, you know, I have a plan orchestrated, or I'm moving into this deer. Now I have wind, you know, noise as cover for sound purposes. But I can tell you this, if there's a wind that's basically upper teens to 20 mile an hour, maybe even middle, like 15 mile an hour, if it's been blowing, you know, before sun up, like let's say it starts blowing heavy at 3 a.m., 4 a.m., 5 a.m., or whatever, 4 a.m., 5 a.m., those deer are almost all of them are bedded down. I mean, I'd say 80 to 90% of the deer are bedded down. I mean, I called that one all season long too, and I'm not sitting here trying to say I called everything right or anything, but I started to actually, for quite a few years, I just was going to go hunting either way. So I didn't really like study it, but I kind of started to put some different things together, you know, and I was like, I'm going to monitor this a lot closer this year and see if this is what it feels like to me that I've evaluated over the years. I just haven't really studied it and like paid super close attention to it. So this season I did, and, you know, pretty much, you know, if it was going to be windy before the sun came up like that extreme wind, I basically would make jokes to the other, like the guy, you know, whether it's Matt or whoever is filming, like we might as well sleep in until about an hour and a half, 2 hours after sun up, you know, because they're going to be bedded down. And generally they're well, almost always, generally, but almost always those deer, you'll see better deer activity, you know, like an hour and a half after, if it's windy already, when the sun pops up, those deer are, like I said, 80, 90% of them, and in my opinion, are bedded already. So you're going to see better movement an hour and a half plus after sun up anytime throughout the mid to late morning than you will right at immediate sun up, because they're bedded. And I think partly why they're bedded is because, you know, so obviously once I basically evaluated this enough to be like, okay, this is what I've kind of noticed over the years, but now I'm like studying it, and it's like pretty much, it's like clockwork, you know? So I was like, okay, why? You know, well, in my opinion, why is because deer can't really see, in my opinion, hardly that much better than we can at night, you know? And like their eyesight is not that great at night. And you know, it's not that great because you could have a deer in plain sight in a field where you can barely make it out. And if you walk through there quietly where they can't smell you, a lot of times they don't even realize you're there. You know, I mean, I think anybody that's hunted very much can attest to situations like that, but in broad daylight, there's not a chance you could ever do that. So obviously they can't see that great at night. Right. So now with high winds, you take away high winds throughout the night, you took away their sight or a good amount of their sight. And you've also taken away their hearing. And now all they have to go off is their nose. And I don't think they're really that confident about only having one sense to go off of. And so I think it just kind of like sketches them out a little bit. And at least once the sun comes up and they have their visual back, even if it's still windy, now they at least can see and smell. Maybe they can't hear worth a damn, but at least they got 2 of their 3 senses back. They probably don't like consciously think about it. It's just kind of like ingrained in them.
Right. They're in survival mode, right? It's like whenever they, you know, even with their nose, whenever they have those high winds, I'm sure you're getting some swirls and stuff like that. So they're still not even getting a consistent wind to follow to make sure they keep themselves out of danger as well. I like the whole draw thing with like the temps and the sun and stuff like that is really interesting to me. So for one, I'm bringing a map with me to Harrisburg whenever you're at the Harrisburg show in Pennsylvania, and I'm going to ask you to show me some of these draws on a map so I know what they look like. And then The other thing I thought was interesting is like I wonder if they prefer when you're able to kind of pick which draws they're going to like, based on what's going on with the temp and the wind and so forth. I wonder if they're getting a more consistent thermal because there's more sun. They're getting a more consistent thermal in a particular part of the draw, which is why there's bedding in that particular area. I mean, do you think there's anything to that? Just since the ground is going to get heated more consistently, they might get a more consistent thermal pool in the morning.
You bring up a good point there. That's not anything that I have really looked into or studied so much. A thermal expert, if you will, somebody that's really studied thermals a lot, might be able to expand on that and give,
right,
a more accurate, but, it's quite possible,
right.
It's very possible that, now obviously they have the wind coming over the ridge, into that draw system. They're out of the wind and then they can catch a little bit of the sun, and then, if they have the thermals working with them,
that
in
thermal
some way
from the bottom,
Correct.
Yeah.
But I mean, for people listening that just heard me talk about sun and a little bit of a warm, like a warm front after a cold front like that. I mean, some people might criticize me off the bat, but I'm serious. Like, go out this season and actually pay attention to it and actually monitor it. But you have to be in you have to be in locations and situations that are actually going to support, like obviously I'm covering a lot of ground, and a lot of times I'm in areas where I can visually survey quite a bit of landscape. So it's really easy for me to, I guess, spot
right.
these, deer utilize and how they're utilizing the sun. And so it's really easy for me to do that. I like I said, I believe deer in fully wooded areas do that as well. And I think even what I've learned in more of the open or partially open country, whether it be the plains, because the deer will do the same thing in the plains. Because even in the plains, you have little crevices, little ditches, and things of that nature. It doesn't have to be a big draw, but they will still utilize it a certain way. I played games with a big buck this last year, and it wasn't that big of a ditch system, but we had 6 stalks in 7 days on the same buck.
Wow.
And he was the smartest deer I've ever hunted. Most of those situations I could get to compound range and not longbow range, and I had to back out because there was just no way to get closer. And finally, we played our cards just right on a situation. Unfortunately, I blew the shot. That's probably my second most behind the story that I already told. That
right.
Just because that was the smartest. That is the smartest deer I've ever actually played games with. Like, that deer was so smart. If the wind would switch, he would move 10 or 20 yards just to accommodate it within a half hour of it switching. It was crazy.
Right.
So I'd never seen a deer quite like that. But anyways, I got a little bit carried away there. But I believe that same what I've been studying in kind of this open country and semi-open country, I believe taking what I've learned from there to a more wooded type environment would allow me to narrow down a lot of the different, I'd actually be able to, I think, rid quite a bit of acreage based off of the terrain, whether the sun's out or not, and the topography and the wind direction. I think I'd be able to more efficiently look at a topo at that point and look at the land and be like, okay, they're going to be bedded here and here, and I can pretty much eliminate most of this other thing. And I think that I'd find a lot of what I've learned in that open country and studied and the partially open country, I could do that in the wooded stuff, because I think that the deer operate very similarly. I mean, and here's one thing, you're in Pennsylvania, but I've had this fall, I put out a lot of feelers to people in different parts of the country. And I said, I just want you to kind of monitor this.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So I've got a very accurate feedback from a handful of individuals that are good big buck hunters.
Mm-hmm.
And so I know what they've told me, which is pretty much what I just kind of said, based off of their evaluations and what they've seen, very much of what I'm seeing in the open country and how these deer utilize like the, and whatnot. It was like basically the same report coming back to me. So, that being said, one thing I've made a couple of jokes about, and I think they'll probably be in the new video, is I was like, how many times over the years, it's almost like in our blood, like when the cold weather moves in, we get this in our blood, like, oh, it's going to be a good day. It's going to be a good day. Right. But how many times do we go out there, freeze our ass off, don't see hardly anything. And then we talk to our buddies, and for the most part, most of them didn't see much either. And then we all just figured we were sitting in the wrong spot. I've talked to a lot of different hunters that have been through that scenario. And I'm not saying that you can't kill a big buck in cold weather or whatnot, because I've definitely done that as well. I'm just saying I'm not that excited about freezing my butt off and lowering my encounter rate and everything like that. That's all I'm saying. Like, I'm freezing cold and it's worse hunting for me. So why would I like it more?
Right. Right. Exactly.
The only time, and to be fair, obviously after post rut and those deer are run down and you get some snow and some cold weather, obviously those deer are in need. So those cold fronts definitely, can work to your advantage a lot more so than a warm front at that time of the year. So I want to definitely clarify on that. But also along with that, when you get cold temperatures like that and snow cover, a lot of those deer are going towards like standing crop, like corn with, it's easy food for them. It's got, it gives them everything that they need, that's best suited for them to survive. But I will say this, as soon as it warms up during the cold, like let's say it's December after rut, as soon as it warms up, generally speaking, not as many deer hit the fields. But if you sit back, if you can survey a woods where there's deer at, they browse a lot heavier from what I've seen.
Right.
So they're browsing, they're up on their feet, they're snacking, they're milling around all day. So they don't need to go out and hit those fields earlier. So if it's super cold in late season and I'm on a solo hunt, if it's super cold with snow cover, I'm probably going to be targeting something closer to a food source. And that food source could be some public land that, some crop that's on some public land. A lot of public lands don't have crop, but there might be some adjacent crop. So I'll be targeting that. If it warms up, if it's going to warm up, well, I'm going to assume that those deer are going to be doing a lot of browsing in the woods, and they're not going to get to that crop. So obviously I'm going to adjust accordingly.
Right. Yeah, no, that all makes sense, man. It's a lot to take in, but I think as you were talking about those warmer days and what your buddies were seeing and what you've seen, I think first anyone who dismisses it is silly, because I mean, you spend an extreme amount of time in the woods in comparison to a lot of other people, you know what I mean? But just by the nature of what you do. So you have a lot of opportunity to observe. So I think that is, valid in itself. I think this year too, while I was in Iowa, it was the best encounters I had. And even when I was in PA, like in pre-rut before I left for Iowa, the best encounters I had were actually on days that were average or above average in temperature, now that I'm thinking about it. And all the best encounters I had while I was in Iowa were all on warmer days. I was out there during that stretch where we had 15 degrees with 0 degree wind chill and whatever. And it was like the first couple of days that I was there, like it was above average temperatures and the hunting was great. It got freakishly cold and it was like someone turned the deer activity off. And then it warmed back up, and I started seeing deer again. Which was
yep. And two of my. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. Keep going. You said you had another point you wanted to add on to that.
No, that was it. It was crazy that it's kind of mirroring what you're saying.
Yeah. It's not something that I think it's for whatever reason. I think years ago, cold fronts got so much hype just because all of a sudden it was like it was more of a late season thing on food source, especially when you have quite a bit of snow cover where there's no, the deer aren't going to be like browsing on the ground. And then I think people just kind of took that as gold throughout the rest of the season as well, backed it up through November, October, September, because I mean, trust me, I've been out in the open country of North Dakota or Wyoming, and it's 90 plus degrees. And I'm thinking it happened to me this year. And it was like low 90s, mid 90 degrees. And I'm thinking there's no way that deer's going to bed down with it this hot, in this open spot. He's going to go find a nice little spot to tuck into the shade. No, I was dead wrong. And I've seen that happen before, but in that moment I'm sweating my, butt off. And I'm thinking I've seen it before where they've done it, like bed in a spot where it's like, why would you do that in this heat? And they, whether it's to get away from bugs or whatever it might be, I'm not sure. But, even at those hot temperatures, it's not like, he's going to bed in the shade right there rather than the sun. I
Right.
definitely don't see a correlation there. What I was going to say to add to what you just said is one of my reports, guys that I was, brought, what I was seeing this fall too was, and I wanted to see if his evaluations were correlating with mine. Is he was located in like right on the line of Wisconsin, Minnesota, West Central, and another contact was in southern Wisconsin. So both of these contacts, I was kind of in contact with, and it was like they were giving me the report because I was actually trying to get back to Wisconsin and do some hunting. So I kind of wanted to know what the deer were doing anyways.
Mm-hmm.
And, all of a sudden they'd say like, okay, there's a cold front coming in. I'm like, yep, get ready. I'd like send a text out. It wasn't a group text. This was individual, but I'd send a text out to both of them, like, get ready. Get ready for things to go pretty cold, pretty quick, and it was like, they kind of joked about it, or whatever. We made some jokes about it because it's still like, yeah, I'm saying it, but it's like, I still got to like get confirmation on this. I'm making jokes,
Right.
It's like, I'm predicting it, but I'm having fun with it. Like I could very well be wrong too at this point, but it was like clockwork. They were like, yeah, it's completely shut down. And then it was like 2 days later, it started to warm up. Both of them were like, boom, they're back. They're back to, seen $3 this morning, cruising around or whatever,
Right.
So, that's, and they're hunting, both those individuals are hunting in more bigger woods. It's not big, like northern Wisconsin woods, but bigger acreage woods where, ridges run for miles. And obviously there's some crop fields that butt up to them and whatnot. But for the most part, it's that wooded type, terrain.
Right. Yep.
So.
But hey, man, I want to be sensitive to your time. I know we talked, we're just a little over an hour here. So there's,
yep.
We might need to do a part 2 because I definitely wanted to get to a point to where I wanted to ask you about, how you hunt differently during the different times of the season. But we might save that for a part 2 because this next question
Sure.
I'm going to ask you might be the most important question of the whole podcast that we've had so far. So how did you guys become such good mechanics?
Good mechanics. I tell you, growing up on that small farm, I guess that goes back to the intro sort of a little bit of where I talked about being, growing up on the small farm. I mean, we just made stuff work. We didn't have a lot of money, and it was like we were constantly repairing machinery and just, figuring out ways to do that. So, I mean, from the time I got my first car, or first vehicle, my dad kind of just got it ingrained in me. Like, you need to fix your own stuff. You don't take it to a repair shop. So I never took it to a repair shop. Other than if it was something major, like the tranny needs to be completely,
Right.
redone or whatever. But outside of that, I mean, all those other types of things like wheel bearings, U-joints, whatever, master cylinder, all, starters, alternators, whatever it might be. I mean, all that kind of stuff is stuff that it probably goes back to that, I just,
Right.
kind of grew up in it, and you just kind of evaluate. I mean, I got some good stories about this last fall a little bit with the minivan, but I don't want to get carried away because they'd take a little while to to tell the story. But
one of my favorite parts of watching this most recent DVD is working on the car. Like that's I don't know why, but I just kind of get a kick out of it. It's I guess it's me being able to laugh a little bit at you guys' expense, but it was just kind of funny as I was watching. It was like there was always that van, man. It's like I'm like, you guys had to put some work into that thing to keep that thing rolling for as long as you did. That's for sure.
Yeah. I mean, there's been some work. To be honest with you, that's cost me a lot less than my Suburban to keep on the road. I mean, that van has seen a lot of gravel, pothole, gravel, crappy roads, and a fair amount of them at a high rate of speed
Right.
over the course of 6 seasons. So,
Right.
I mean, if you looked under the undercarriage of the van, it would be like Turbo Dan had never been in the minivan up until like 2 weeks ago when we actually went to try to give it away. I was like, he told me, he's like, I've never been in this. He was the one taking the video. Well, anyways, we needed to load it onto this trailer or whatnot. And he's like, I've never been here. I was like, really? And he had to drive it for a few miles. He gets out and he's like, man, he's like, I can't believe how well that thing just cruises down the gravel road, just straight as an arrow. I was like, yeah, you should peek your head under there and look. You'll really be baffled. So, anyway, I mean, the minivan's a beast. There's just no way around it. 20 plus miles a gallon, handles the roads great. And yeah.
That's awesome, man. So, hey, dude, I'll ask you one last question here. It's something I always like to end with, before I let you go. It's a really simple question, but it's usually kind of a nuanced answer, if you will, because there's a lot of different feelings about it. But I wanted to ask you, why does Jared Scheffler hunt?
Why do I hunt? I mean, I guess you could say that I'm addicted to it, I guess.
Right.
I've always been. Obviously there's different people hunt for different reasons, So, I just grew up, I think from a very young age, like I kind of had said, I'd sit around and I'd listen to the deer stories from these other hunters before I could hunt. And I always remember, like the stories where they got away or the big one that they almost got. Obviously the ones that they got were cool too. But I think I've just always enjoyed like the chase and the challenge of it. I mean, before I could hunt, I remember going on some of those drives, we'd do small pushes and stuff. So like when we'd push a cornfield, for instance, I would be like cutting through the corn rows trying to find a deer. And then once I popped my head in the row where I could see where the deer is, I'd kind of backtrack, loop around and just see how close I could get to the deer. It's like, obviously I can't, and I got very close one time, almost touched the deer, but didn't quite touch the deer. But I mean, so I just think I kind of like love like the challenge and the pursuit of it and the chase of it. And I think that's also why I really love hunting on the ground too, is because there's quite a bit of failure in that process too. And there's quite a few things that you have to calculate and things have to go right in a short amount of time sometimes in those situations. I mean, especially when you're filming, you got two guys there, you're very exposed. You might not have time to range find. You might just have a split second to draw back. Is he at 30 or is he at 37? It could make a difference or whatever. And that was in the compound era. Obviously I shoot longbow now, but for the guys that are shooting compound, that situation happens quite a bit. Mechanicals might not be a good choice for me because I'm hunting on the ground and there might be a little bit of grass. And so a fixed blade is obviously going to not get sidetracked in that type of situation,
right.
And obviously there's a lot of other factors that come into play on the ground too. You're processing like, okay, wind and how I'm going to get me and this camera guy in there and utilizing the terrain. So I think, just all of that, it's very challenging and a lot of things got to go right to make it actually happen, and come together.
Nice, man. So. That's a perfectly good answer, man. But I appreciate you coming on, dude. And before I let you go, like if you wouldn't mind, I know you're going to be on at the Harrisburg show in Pennsylvania. But if you wouldn't mind, let people know where they can find out more about you, when maybe the DVD is going to come out, and what other shows you guys have going on this year where people can run into you guys.
Yeah, for sure. So our website's whitetailadrenaline.com. We've got all 12 seasons that we've been filming on there. They can watch, people that haven't checked out the videos can watch different trailer videos to get an idea. I mean, the trailer videos only kind of showcase so much. It showcases generally a little bit more of the spot and stock action, but it doesn't showcase, like the vehicle breakdowns, the funny stuff that happens in the middle, whatnot, but that's all there. And then as far as shows, obviously, like you mentioned, we're going to Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. That's February 1st through the 9th. And then we'll be in Des Moines, Iowa for the Iowa Deer Classic. and then to Lansing, Michigan for the Deer and Turkey Expo, and then Columbus, Ohio for the Deer and Turkey Expo. And then, so all three of those are in the month of March. And then Madison, Wisconsin, first week of April, and then Deer Fest in West Bend, Wisconsin. Yeah, West Bend. I had a blank there for a second. And that'll be like first weekend in August. So those are the shows that we have on schedule right now.
Awesome.
And then the new videos, traditionally we try to release the new videos at the Deer Fest show. You know, they might come out. We're hoping to maybe potentially release them just a touch earlier this year, but there's a lot of things. Yeah, production takes a while to go through that amount of unscripted content. So
yeah. Awesome. Well, be sure to give these guys a follow too on Instagram. Your Instagram is pretty funny. I always enjoy following your stories and your posts. Be sure to give these guys a follow there. Jared, brother, I appreciate you coming on, man. We'll definitely have to do a part number 2 because I got a couple more loaded questions for you to try to help me up my game with the ground and pound, if you will. But I'll see you in Harrisburg. I'll be sure to stop by and say hi when I'm there.
Okay. Yeah, that sounds great. Thanks for having me on, Clint. Appreciate it.
All right, folks, that is a wrap for today's show. I'd like to thank all of you for listening. And if you haven't yet, please head over to iTunes and leave us a 5-star rating. And be sure to subscribe to the podcast. We'd be super appreciative if you'd be able to do those 2 things for us. And before I shut this thing down, I need to give a big shout out to our partners who continue to help us make this podcast possible. Tethered, Exodus Outdoor Gear, Skull Brew Coffee Company, Gumleaf USA Boots, and Day 6 Specialized Gear. And until next time, we'll see y'all.